My name is Kelley Vlahos. I'm an editor with Responsible Statecraft at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. And I am very excited to be here with Trita Parsi, who is our Executive Vice President. And I wanted to talk to you, Trita, about a very interesting piece that you had written for Responsible Statecraft that had talked about or speculated whether or not Mike Pompeo has signaled there might be some October surprise surrounding our U.S. foreign policy with Iran ahead of the November elections. I was wondering if you might want to talk about the sort of dynamics that are going on in the Middle East right now and some of these signals that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is putting out right now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kelley. It's great being here with you. And if we just listen to what Mike Pompeo himself is saying, as well as the briefing by Elliot Abrams last week, they're clearly signaling that the United States is going to start enforcing UN sanctions that the vast majority of the members of the UN Security Council believe do not exist. And that enforcement, meaning interception of and taking of Iranian vessels and ships on the high seas, has a very high risk of sparking some form of a military confrontation with Iran. Let me take a step back to explain why I'm saying that, implementing sanctions that don't exist. The United States was at first party to the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, Iran nuclear deal. And within that, there was a mechanism that allowed a party to that agreement to snap back sanctions on Iran almost with automaticity if they assessed that Iran had been in violation of the agreement. And it only required them giving notification to the Security Council. And then within the next 30 days, a resolution would have to be passed that said that no, everything is okay, and we're not going to snap back sanctions. And then the US could put a veto against that. And as a result, automatically the nuclear deal would essentially be eliminated and all of the sanctions would go back in. The problem is the United States said that it has ceased being a participant in the JCPOA when it pulled out in May 2018. But now the Trump administration is saying is that by default of having negotiated the deal, the US is automatically a participant and as a result has a right to snap back sanctions. 13 out of 15 Security Council members disagree with the Trump administration on this. And that includes the UK, France, and Germany. So we're not talking about the United States being opposed by China and Russia. We're talking about the United States here being opposed by its closest allies in the Security Council. So they clearly believe that there has been no snapback mechanism at all instigated because the US is not in a position to do so. It has no standing. Now, Mike Pompeo does not seem to care too much about the opinions of others and has gone forward in saying that the clock has started to tick. And on September 20th at midnight, which is this coming Sunday, the snapback 30-day period is over with. And after that, the UN Security Council sanctions come back in. The rest of the Security Council disagrees. But then Pompeo goes one step further. And he says the United States will stop at nothing in order to implement those sanctions. Implementing those sanctions means intercepting Iranian ships or non-Iranian ships that are being accused of carrying Iranian fuel or oil or other goods. And as you can imagine, this is going to create massive problems. A commentator on Bloomberg said that this is state-sponsored piracy because it's already happened that the Trump administration has confiscated Iranian or ships that have gone to Iran. But those have all taken place far away from Iranian waters, meaning that the Iranian Navy didn't have much of a capacity doing anything about it. If the Trump administration now actually escalates and tries to do this very close to the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, then it's going to be a very different scenario. And what I'm worried about is that this will be used as some sort of a October surprise. We're only 6-7 weeks away from the elections. And that the Iranian response will then be used by the Trump administration or specifically by Pompeo as a sign of aggression from the Iranian side that would justify an even stronger response from the United States. And then suddenly we are in some form of a war only weeks before the elections. And I'm not saying that this will happen on Sunday night or on Monday. I'm saying that if in the next 6 or so weeks, we end up in a scenario in which desperation starts to emerge in the Trump camp in regards to the elections, that this will be a card that Pompeo will put in front of Trump and try to convince him to do.
So what about this September 20th date? Is that an arbitrary date, or is that something that had been baked into the agreement? And how are our allies reacting to Pompeo's recent rhetoric?
So it's not arbitrary. If the United States actually had standing and was a party to the US, to the JCPOA, then from the date that it sends that notification to the UN Security Council, the Council then has 30 days to act. Otherwise, the snapback takes place. So Pompeo there is actually following the rules, but without having standing. And he's counting the days from when that letter went to the Security Council from the United States. And the response of the Security Council, incidentally, by the Security Council president, was to respond to that letter and saying, you don't have standing, you cannot do this.
So have we heard anything from our allies since Pompeo made these statements regarding the seizure of ships, for example? How is that being reacted to?
I've not seen any direct reactions to that. And I think part of the reason for that is that the other side, these European countries and others, their strategy is to try to not bring attention to this.
Yeah.
And essentially not try to almost ignore it to death. But you scratch the surface and you will see that they are worried. I mean, I've gotten reactions from diplomats and others who are on the Quincy mailing list and who received this, that this is a concern that Europeans and others are taking very, very seriously.
Now, you've also written about the recent news or speculation or the intelligence supposedly about an Iranian plot to assassinate the US ambassador to South Africa. Was this yet another attempt at a possible October surprise? Can you talk a little bit about what the reaction has been to that and how that might lead to yet more confrontation before the election?
Yeah, so just to back up a bit, so Politico ran with a story, I think it was Sunday night, this past Sunday, saying that there's, the United States has picked up intelligence that the Iranians have been contemplating a plot to assassinate the US ambassador to South Africa as part of a revenge for the assassination of the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani earlier in January. And this, of course, caused some stir. This is obviously a very, very serious accusation. Reality is that Iran has a history of having engaged in such assassinations in the past. In fact, quite a few Middle Eastern countries, unfortunately, do. So it is not something that can be just dismissed out of hand, but the circumstances around it raises a lot of questions as to how solid this intelligence was. First of all, one thing that was quite fascinating is that the South African police came out the day after the story and said that they had found out about the alleged plot that same day, essentially indicating they found out about it through Politico, which means that apparently we had intelligence that our ambassador in South Africa was at risk, and instead of notifying the South African police and ensuring that they did everything they could to protect her, we leaked it to the press here in the United States, which doesn't give you confidence that there really was much of a plot there, particularly mindful of the fact that there's a bit of a pattern here. Remember what the Trump administration and Trump himself actually said in order to justify the assassination of Soleimani. He said that there was intelligence of an imminent threat, meaning that Soleimani was planning, he was just about to pull the trigger on some big attack against the United States or US targets inside of Iraq. And as a result, he had to do it. Now, we know afterwards that, of course, apparently he was debating whether he should assassinate Soleimani or not on the golf course with Senator Lindsey Graham, which does not leave you with the impression that this was some sort of an imminent scenario that required very quick action and the option of waiting did not exist. Moreover, when the Trump administration provided their report to Congress, including the briefings that they gave to Republican members of Congress, there was no evidence of imminent attack that was presented. In the written report, there's even no mention of it. So we're seeing a pattern in which accusations of this kind are thrown out, are being reported, but in reality, there's nothing there. Now, I'm not saying that there's nothing there in the South African case. I think it's quite likely that there's been some pickup of intelligence, but it's probably not been fully vetted and may not have been particularly strong. In fact, when Trump himself talked about it on Twitter, it was quite fascinating. He did not say that according to intelligence reports. He said according to press reports. He was not referring to the intelligence, which again raises the question, did he not see the intelligence? Was there no intelligence? Why is he referencing press reports? Again, question marks around this story that I think, particularly mindful of the lack of credibility of the administration right now, warrants us to be quite careful. But it did achieve one thing, and I'm not saying this is deliberate or not, but when you take a look at all of these different data points, question marks do arise. The one thing it achieved was headlines that said Iran is planning to assassinate US ambassador. So we're kind of conditioning the American public that there's some form of aggression being planned against us, which then makes it easier to pull the trigger and say, we have to strike back. And this is what worries me, that because of the electoral clock here in the United States, there may be a measure to do this, even though the underlying threat, underlying intelligence, etc., really is not there.
Well, you know, you talked about a pattern, and since the Republican National Convention, there has been a sort of drumbeat, whether it through, press conferences like this and statements, but also the campaign ads coming out of the Trump campaign have really been hammering away at Trump's aggressive, muscular policy against Iran. I saw a campaign ad recently where it talked about the assassination of Soleimani, and as though this was part of, Trump's robust, foreign policy and his ability to go after America's enemies. So you're seeing this as maybe of a piece. You have the supposed assassination attempt, South African ambassador, but also this tough talk on the snapback. Are they building, is this more politics, or is this serious foreign policy that could lead to actual conflict, or both?
The danger is that it's actually both, that there are elements in the administration that views it just as politics. They have no intention of taking it further, but they think it's helping them in the elections, or it's good for fundraising, etc. And then there's another element in the administration that is going along with it, pretending it's just politics, but actually is cornering the president into a situation in which, not saying that he will be forced to do something, but dramatically increases the likelihood that he will. And this, I think, is, again, another pattern that we've seen, particularly when it comes to policy with Iran. It seems to me that Trump actually genuinely wanted another negotiation. I mean, he rushed over to shake the hands of Kim Jong-un. So he wants this. He really appreciates and values it. He's just been convinced that the way to do it is by imposing more sanctions and maximum pressure. And anyone who actually had any experience negotiating with Iran or getting to negotiations with Iran would have clearly been able to say this is the opposite of a successful strategy. This approach will minimize any chances, certainly assassination of Soleimani will minimize any chances of a negotiation. But those whispering in his ears, and I would say that that is including MBS in Saudi Arabia, MBZ in UAE, Bibi Netanyahu, know very well that it's an argument that he will probably be susceptible to, because essentially say, in order for you to negotiate, you have to be really tough, you have to really squeeze them, and then they will come and they will capitulate. It seems to work well with Trump because that is how he's probably run his businesses. It does not work in international relations the same way.
Well, another piece of the pattern that we haven't talked about just yet is the quote unquote historic peace deal that had been signed this week involving the UAE and Israel, with the help of the United States via, Jared Kushner, you know, many people within the national security community, other than seeing this as a quote unquote peace deal, are also saying, well, this is sort of building a coalition against Iran, that this is a sort of, this is a signal to Iran that its friends are disappearing in the region. And what the timing of this cannot be coincidental, I would imagine, if we're talking about this pattern, this lead up to the election.
I think it's been quite common to point to Iran as this is what driving them closer together, this common threat. And I think on a superficial level, that is correct. But when you scratch the surface, you see a different reality, not one that necessarily negates that Iran is a factor in all of this, because clearly it is, but something that has actually had much more to do with us than with Iran. The real common interest between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, the real threats that are common to them that they're faced with, is not necessarily Iran. Again, not to say that they don't have problems with Iran, they do. But the real common threat that they're truly worried about is the opinion of the American public, which is that more and more Americans want the United States to come home from the region, leave it militarily, not to abandon it, certainly not abandon it diplomatically, but end these endless wars and dramatically change America's military posture in the region. This is an overarching concern that they have, because if the United States leave, it does change the balance of power. It does reduce the maneuverability of Israel. And for countries like Saudi Arabia and Israel and the UAE, it will have dramatic impact on what they can and cannot do, since they're currently enjoying a role in the region that their own power cannot justify. It's only there because the US is backing them. So they clearly don't want to see that given up. Israel, I think, is a country that actually would be able to do quite well, even if the United States wasn't there, because it's very strong in its own right. But if you're sitting in Riyadh or Abu Dhabi, clearly your power is really based on what the US is willing to do for you, not so much what you're willing to do for yourself. So keeping the US connected to the region, staying in the region, not leaving, is an overarching objective that all of them have. Iran happens to be probably the best motivator to keep the US in the region by inflating the Iranian threat. Again, not to say that there isn't one, but inflating it. And moving in that direction is something that helps. And I think what we are seeing here with what they call a peace deal, but in essence really is an arms deal. In order for the UAE to be able to buy F-35s, it had to recognize Israel diplomatically. The Israeli media is reporting that Jared Kushner essentially said, if you want to keep America's support, you have to normalize with Israel. So, but for the UAE, why would they want the F-35s? Because if you buy F-35s, absent a defense pact with the United States, this is the second best thing. If you're buying that amount of American weaponry, particularly the top-notch, high-quality, high-technology weapons from the United States, there is an unwritten understanding that that means the United States to come to your aid and defense. Look what's happening in Yemen right now. The Saudis are knee-deep in that war, unnecessary, and they could not fight that without the United States. And the United States is aiding Saudi Arabia to a large part because all of their weapons are American. That sense of obligation. So I think the UAE is going along with this because this is a way for them to tie the United States to their security for another decade or so, which in my view makes the United States the big loser in this equation, because the American public wants to come home, and this is going to keep US forces stuck in the region.
So you don't think that this deal signals that we are going to start backing away, that we are helping Israel and these Arab states get together and do their own security and their own alliances while we slowly remove ourselves from the situation? You're not seeing it that way.
I definitely see that an argument can and should be made that as a result of this, the US can remove much of its military posture there. That is not the way I think it's going to be played, and certainly not what the UAE and others have in mind. In fact, every time we've seen some sort of an agreement of this kind, it has led to more American obligations to help those countries militarily. And I think the argument will be that staying in the region is no longer endless war. Staying in the region is the protection of the peace. It's a false argument, but it's the argument that will be made. And what you will see, I suspect, is that the pro-Saudi lobby, the pro-Likud lobby, defense lobby will all now converge in pushing for the United States to stay and probably boost its military presence in the region. Whereas in the past, those lobbies were not necessarily working in alignment.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I'll be waiting to see what happens after September 20th when Mike Pompeo's perceived snapback sanctions go into place, and let's hope for the best. And I'm sure we'll have plenty to talk about in the weeks to come.
Thank you so much, Kelley.